Sony is really well known for their interchangeable lens cameras, but not as many people are aware of their compact point-and-shoot lineup. And this year, there are 4 point-and-shoot cameras that you can buy new from Sony that are all a little bit different and designed for different types of creators. So in this video, let's shoot some content with all 4 of these, let you know which one is actually my personal favorite, and figure out if you might actually need to pick up your first point-and-shoot camera this year.
You gotta just press record.
The first camera on our list is the Sony ZV-1. This was released back in May of 2020, and it was actually the first ZV series camera to be released. Now we have like 6 or 7 ZV series cameras with their different respective feature sets, but the ZV-1 was the first. The ZV-1 retails for $748, but often can be found for around $698 on sale, so maybe try to time it to where you can get this camera on sale because that'll be a much better deal. One of the best things about this camera is, of course, its size and weight, and really all of these cameras actually have this benefit. Point and shoot cameras really are just so compact and easy to throw in any sort of travel bag or satchel. These cameras are also really great for people who don't want to use your phone to make content. Your phone as a content creation tool can do at least some of what a point and shoot camera can do. And then of course a phone can do a lot more in other instances because you can call people and make texts and scroll social media. But I know for me personally, if I'm out making content, I'm always using my phone as a tool for reviewing my shot lists or scripts or communicating with my team and like our project management software, or even like if I'm in the car using it as a GPS or taking calls. You know, I use my phone for a bunch of different things, and I don't love having to use my phone for both use cases, right? Like a content creation tool and a productivity tool. It just gets a little tricky. Phones have become really awesome at making content, but I typically like to separate and have a dedicated camera and then my phone as a productivity tool. So with the original ZV-1, we get a built-in 24 to 70 millimeter equivalent zoom lens that actually performs pretty well. Image quality with the ZV-1 is quite nice for such a compact little camera. Photo results are certainly better than what most cell phones can produce because the ZV-1 has a much larger 1-inch sensor, which nowadays most phones don't have that large of a sensor. Now, in terms of video quality, I think it looks really good. I think it is kind of on par to what most new cell phones are doing in 2024, looking ahead at 2025. These cell phones are getting better and better at having 4K video, but I think the ZV-1 is at least on par with cell phone quality, if not a little bit better. The 24 to 70 focal range on a full frame camera is typically the range that I use for professional photo and video work. So I'm pretty used to this focal range, but in my opinion, it really isn't the focal range that I would choose if I was going to be vlogging. It's just not wide enough at 24 millimeters most of the time. Unless you really extend your arm out with a GorillaPod or something, that 24 is going to typically be a little bit too tight. I think it's a great focal length for like walk around photography and video work if you're shooting other people, but in terms of vlogging, 24 is just a little bit too tight. This lens does have a variable aperture, but it's actually not too bad. At 24 millimeters, you're shooting at f1.8, which lets in a lot of light. And then when you zoom all the way into 70 millimeters, you're now shooting at an f2.8 aperture. So that's still going to let in a decent amount of light in lower light situations, and you're really only losing about 1 stop of light if you zoom in all the way to 70 millimeters. With this camera, you get 4K video up to 30 frames per second, which I think looks really, really good. And you also get 1080p up to 120 FPS, which is kind of cool if you want to do some high frame rate shooting. This camera also features a built-in ND filter, which is really cool and really helpful when you're shooting in brighter environments and you need to cut out light from hitting your camera sensor. You can toggle on the ND filter in order to shoot at better shutter speeds for video especially. So that's typically when I'm using the ND filter, if I want to make sure my settings are correct and I'm not cranking my shutter speed or having to close up my aperture. This ND filter is really helpful in those situations. This camera also features a multi-interface hot shoe, which is really helpful if you want to pair this camera with some different accessories like flashes or microphones, and you want to create content using these additional tools. That hot shoe will be really helpful, and it's nice to see in a smaller point and shoot camera like this. And with the ZV-1, we actually get a really high quality flip out screen. And a fun fact here is that this is actually the first camera that Sony created to sport a fully flip out screen. Most of Sony's other cameras at this point, if they did have a flip screen, it was a flip up screen, but this is the first one to have a flip out screen, which a lot of people really like. There are a few drawbacks for going with the original ZV-1, including we've already touched on the 24 millimeters is the widest focal length that you have with this camera. So it's going to be a little bit tight for certain vloggers. If you want to film yourself, it might not be the right fit. It's also operating on the older Sony menu system, which feels pretty dated at this point. It's kind of just like an endless endless scroll of settings that you have to work through in order to adjust some of your camera settings. It's definitely not my favorite menu. It also features a really limited touchscreen. You're really only able to touch the back of the screen to focus on certain points of the frame, and it's not a full touchscreen. You can't really navigate the menus with the touch operation, so it's overall pretty limited in that regard. Also, the quarter 20 thread on the bottom of the camera for mounting tripod plates is in a really rough position because you have to fully remove any tripod plate that you might have on the camera in order to access your battery door or your SD card. So if you like to mount this on a tripod or have it on a vlog stick or something, you're not going to be able to access and swap batteries really quickly or pull out your SD card to transfer files without removing that plate on the bottom of the camera, which is kind of obnoxious. And I wish they would have, with the original version at least, moved that quarter 20 screw to a different part of the camera. So all things considered, I think this Sony ZV-1 is pretty solid. I don't think it's the best camera on our list, but overall in 2024, if you can find one for a good deal, especially on sale, this could be a really good choice for your first point and shoot camera. So after the ZV-1, they decided to release the ZV-1F, and it was released in October of 2022 and is still sold new today for around $498, which is a pretty competitive price point, all things considered. So this camera really solved two issues for creators who weren't satisfied with the original ZV-1. First would be affordability at $498. It's the most budget option on our list. And I think it's actually this year the cheapest camera that you can buy from Sony in new condition. So they don't make a cheaper camera than the ZV-1F. And the second issue they were solving was the need for a wider focal length. So with the ZV-1F, the F stands for fixed. And with this camera, you get a fixed 20mm lens that actually performs pretty well for video and photo results. This lens has a constant aperture of f2, which actually lets in quite a bit of light, and you're going to be able to get a pretty shallow depth of field with that f2.0. The beauty about the ZV-1F is you really don't have to think too much when you use this camera. They really simplified the 1F to make it as easy as possible for beginners to use. And look at this, they also shifted the little tripod screw over to the right side of the camera. So now you can access the battery door and the SD card without have to completely de-rigging your camera or taking it off a tripod. Now you can just open the nice little battery door, access your battery and your SD card. Thank you, Sony. I don't know why you didn't do this the first time. They also upgraded this camera to add a USB-C port over the ZV-1's micro USB port, which is cool because you can now stream through the USB-C port. Although it is limited to 720p streaming, which is honestly pretty irritating if I'm being honest. And if you need a higher resolution, you could stream using an HDMI capture card instead. This camera has a lot of the same video specs with 4K footage up to 30 frames per second, as well as 1080p at 120 FPS for slow motion footage. But unfortunately, there are quite a few trade-offs to going with the ZV-1F for the lower price point. Because of that lower price, they had to sacrifice some things with this camera to make it more affordable. And the things that they sacrifice are actually pretty huge. So you're going to want to be aware of several of these pieces, starting with this camera has a tendency to focus breathe and has these sort of weird jitters when you're recording with autofocus. I could not get rid of this in all of my testing with this camera, and it's not really noticeable on yourself when you're recording, but if you look over to the fringes, the corners of the frame, you can see this weird sort of jittering happening, which is really frustrating. Now, if you want, you can get around this by switching your camera into manual focus and really dialing in your focus to make sure you're tack sharp, and then none of those jitters happen. But if you're going to pay $500 for a camera, you would like for that camera to be able to autofocus without these weird jitters. So this is a big consideration if you are going to go for the ZV-1F. Just know that that's probably going to happen if you're recording with autofocus. This camera is also unable to shoot in the RAW file format, which is honestly blows my mind. Every camera that I've ever owned is able to shoot in the RAW file format, except for this camera, which is pretty frustrating. I'm somebody who likes to edit my images, and if I'm going to be editing, I'm going to be shooting in the RAW file format just to retain the most amount of information in my photos. So I just can't believe that this camera can't shoot in RAW. Blows my mind. They also removed the built-in ND filter with this camera, so you don't get that cool feature as well. And the hot shoe is also not a multi-interface hot shoe, so you can't attach some of those electronic accessories that interact with the camera. You can use it as a standard hot shoe and then connect a microphone into the hot shoe and then plug that into your camera, but it has no contact points to be able to communicate to these electronic devices. I'll link some of our favorite microphones that work with the ZV series cameras down in the description below. So the ZV-1F does have quite a few drawbacks, and you've just got to ask yourself if those cons ZV-1s add up to over $250 in value to you or not, because for around $200 to $250 more, you could get the original ZV-1, which in my opinion is a much better camera. But if they don't, then you can save yourself some money and go for the ZV-1F. Now fast forward to May of 2023 and we get the update to the ZV-1, which is the ZV-1 Mark II. And really this was a response to some of the issues that both the ZV-1 and the ZV-1F had. And honestly, they did a really good job on improving on the past iterations of the ZV-1 series. So the first thing they did is they changed the lens. So now this lens is an 18 to 50 millimeter lens versus the 24 to 70 that they had on the version 1. So this is actually going to give you the widest field of view from any of the ZV-1 series. 18 millimeters is definitely wide enough to do your vlogging or to use it for a webcam in a tighter office space. It really is a pretty good quality lens with a very usable focal length for walk around photography or for video work. They also upgraded the touchscreen over the ZV-1, which they actually also did with the ZV-1F. And these touchscreens are fully functional. So you can adjust all of your settings by just touching the back of the screen, which is super intuitive. You can even use the back of the screen to zoom in and out without having to use the physical zoom rocker on the camera. And you can also touch the back of the screen to record, which is a really cool feature. They also upgraded the microphone in the ZV-1 Mark II, which a lot of people complained about the older microphones in these point and shoot cameras. This is a quick audio test with the ZV-1 Mark II's internal microphone. I think it sounds pretty good. Overall though, I still find myself attaching a microphone to the hot shoe if I'm gonna go out and record audio. They also brought back that really cool ND filter that they had in the ZV Mark I that they dropped in the ZV-1F. They gave it back to us for the Mark II, which is a really big win. You also get a cool cinematic vlog mode, which is cool for people who want to shoot in a more cinematic looking style really easily. This forces the camera to shoot at 24 frames per second, which is that cinematic look that people always talk about. You also get black bars that appear on top of the screen to emulate sort of that widescreen looking format. And then you can dial in some different color options as well. I think this is kind of a cool feature if it's something you're interested in, but most people probably will not use this. And they also shifted the tripod screw over just like they did on the ZV-1F to give you better access to that battery door and SD card slot. The couple of cons that you will see with the Mark II are, first, the variability of the aperture has actually increased quite a bit. So at 18 millimeters, you shoot at f1.8, but then when you zoom all the way into 50 millimeters, your lens stops down to f4 automatically. So you're losing 2 full stops of light when you zoom into 50 millimeters. That's actually a pretty significant increase to the variability of this lens versus the Mark I that only stopped down to f2.8 at 70 millimeters. So if you are somebody who shoots at the longer focal lengths that these cameras provide more often, like you like to zoom in and get some reach out of your lenses, the ZV-1, the original one, is actually probably a better option than the ZV-1 Mark II for this reason. And now the rest of the cons that come with this camera aren't unique to the ZV-1 Mark II. All of these cameras have these cons, but in particular, it's just disappointing because the ZV-1 Mark II is the newest camera on this list. And I really wish it had some of these features, including better battery performance. The battery performance of these cameras are absolutely awful. I have to bring like 6 or 7 batteries out with me all the time if I'm recording with these cameras because the battery just suffers so bad when you're shooting video especially. All of these cameras practically are using the same sensor as well, so you're not getting really any enhancements in image quality as you pay more for your respective camera that you're deciding to purchase. You would think if you spend $900 or $1,000 or $500, there'd be some disparity there in image quality, but there really is not. They didn't improve the image quality much at all with the ZV-1 Mark II. And you also get no 4K at 60 frames per second. So if you want to do anything slow motion related with any of these cameras, you're going to have to shoot in 1080p, which is obviously not ideal for a 4K workflow. All things considered though, the ZV-1 Mark II is pretty dope. Now, even though the ZV-1 Mark II is the newest camera on our list, it actually isn't even the most expensive. So for our last camera, we're going to go back in time 5 years to August of 2019 when the RX100 Mark VII was released. Now, even though this camera is over 5 years old, this thing still costs $1,300 new, which is wild. That is so expensive for a point and shoot camera, but this camera is actually pretty sick and has some unique features that the rest of the ZV-1 series cameras do not have. We'll be sure to link this camera down in the description below, as well as all the rest of the cameras on our list. In terms of all the technical specs, you get a lot of the same features that the original ZV-1 had, including 4K up to 30 frames per second. You get some of the high frame rate shooting up to 960 FPS, and you can take high quality raw images with this camera. But a lot of the benefits and why this this camera is a lot more expensive are some of the additional features with the physical body of the RX100 Mark VII. The first thing being the lens. The lens of this camera is a 24 to 200 millimeter focal length equivalent, which is absolutely mind-blowing. For context, if I wanted to get that same focal length with a mirrorless camera, I would have to bring these two lenses. And look at these things. These things are massive. This is the 24 to 70 and this is the 70 to 200. And both of these combine to give the same focal range that's in the RX100 Mark VII. Isn't that just insane? The reason I ended up buying this camera was specifically to be able to shoot concerts and create concert films from the crowd. I used to shoot a ton of concerts and even toured with some big name artists back in the day, but there were times where I couldn't find a way to get a press pass for a show that I wanted to shoot, but I still wanted to make a dope concert video. And the lens of the RX100 was perfect for being able to shoot from the crowd and still be able to get really cool looking video and photos. So besides the lens, this camera also features a really nifty pop-up viewfinder. And actually when you pop up the viewfinder, the camera automatically turns on as well. But this is really neat for people who like to shoot with a viewfinder. A lot of photographers feel like it's a necessity to have that viewfinder functionality, especially if you're trying to take good composition and the sun is shining right on the back of your screen. Sometimes it can be kind of difficult. So this camera, along with a lot of the older RX100 series models as well, have this viewfinder. So we'll link some of those other cameras down in the description below as well. But if you need a viewfinder, the RX100 series provides you that really cool viewfinder to shoot through, whether you're making photo or video content. Also around the lens, you get what's called a control ring, which controls several different functions. You can map it to control your aperture value or your exposure compensation or your zoom or manual focus, which none of the ZV-1 series cameras have this function button. And some photographers feel like this is an essential addition to the RX100 series. And this feature alone sometimes will justify someone upgrading from a ZV-1 series to the RX100 series just because of this little function ring. You also get a little pop-up flash that you can use for taking photos, and you can actually pull it back a little bit too to be able to use as a bounce flash. So it's not directly shining the flash directly on your subject, which can look a little bit harsh at times. So I actually like using this as a bounce flash. It does make for a really soft and pleasing light if you just need to add a little splash of light to your scene. This camera also features a flip up screen instead of a flip out screen. And I don't know about you, but I personally prefer the flip up screen because my line of sight is more in line with where the lens would be. If I'm using some of these other flip out screens, if I need to look at myself, I'm like looking over to the side at the monitor instead of the lens. But this one right here, it's perfectly in line. So I can just quickly glance up or even out of my peripherals. It's just easier to see when the screen is directly above the lens versus out to the side. So I'm a big fan of the flip up screen. I'm team bring back flip up screens. Now, even though I just said like 20 things I love about this camera, there are 3 things that I can think of that this camera, I wish it had. First would be they had to remove the ND filter. There's actually versions of the RX100 series that have an ND filter, but because they put in such a wide zoom range with this camera, they had to remove it to account for the additional focal length that they were adding out to 200 millimeters. So that is a trade-off. You don't get the built-in ND, which is a bit of a bummer for a lot of people. You also don't get a hot shoe with this camera. So in place of the hot shoe, they give you the electronic viewfinder, which in my opinion is a pretty cool trade-off, but some people will definitely want a hot shoe to mount a mic on top of your camera. This camera does have an audio jack, so you can plug in microphones to the camera, but you're gonna have to host that microphone off camera somewhere, which can just be a little bit weird for a lot of scenarios. I'll link some of these parts that I used to build this off camera microphone setup down in the description below. And the last con is that it's just still operating on that older menu system, the same menu that the original ZV-1 operates under, because this camera was actually put out before the original ZV-1. So it's still got that old menu. So in my opinion, this camera is really designed for professionals, especially professional photographers. So if you need the best photo results you can possibly get and the most features available for your photo shooting, I think the RX100 Mark VII is still a better option than all of the ZV series cameras. Or this is also for people who really need that reach at 200 millimeters. So for me, I didn't buy this for its photo features. I actually bought it for the lens feature to produce concert film. So there's some particular types of video creators that I think the RX100 would be a better fit for, even though the ZV-1 series would typically be considered better for video creators. If you need the focal range of the RX100 series, then you can go that route instead. So these are the 4 point-and-shoot cameras you can purchase in new condition in 2024. And I'm curious, which of these are your favorite? Have you actually used any of them before, or do you want to purchase one in particular? Just let us know down in the comments below. If you want to check out some of our other favorite cameras for beginners that Sony actually offers, some of which are even cheaper than the ZV-1F if you buy them used, you can check out this video right here on the screen, and we'll see you in the next video.